The job posting appeared on a locksmith forum he frequented during the slow winter months. It was brief, almost cryptic in its wording, offering triple the usual rate for what seemed like a straightforward contract. A monastery high in the Carpathian Range needed someone with expertise in antique locks and door mechanisms. The position required a stay of 2 weeks, room and board included, and the work involved cataloging, maintaining, and in some cases reinforcing the security of various doors throughout the ancient structure. What caught his attention beyond the generous pay was the final line: discretion essential. Inquiries about sealed chambers will not be answered. He had been working as a locksmith for nearly 15 years, specializing in historical buildings and antique security systems, churches, old government buildings, museums. He had worked on them all. The craft fascinated him, the way each lock told a story of the era it came from, the paranoia or trust of the people who commissioned it. His apartment was small and his savings smaller, so when the initial deposit appeared in his account within hours of his application, he packed his tools and booked a train heading east. The journey took 3 days, first by rail through industrial towns that gradually gave way to forests, then by bus along increasingly narrow roads that climbed into the mountains, and finally by a hired car that struggled up a dirt path barely wide enough for its frame. The driver, a local man who spoke little, kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror with an expression that might have been pity or concern. When they finally stopped, the driver pointed up a stone path that vanished into the mist and refused to go further. Even when offered extra money, the monastery emerged from the fog like something from another century, which in truth it was. Stone walls rose 4 stories, dark and imposing, with narrow windows that looked more like arrow slits than openings for light. The architecture was a strange hybrid of Orthodox and Catholic traditions, with Byzantine domes sitting oddly alongside Gothic spires. Moss covered much of the northern face, and in places the stone had cracked, though the structure still radiated a sense of permanence, as if it had stood for centuries and would stand for centuries more regardless of human presence. A monk met him at the main entrance. The man was elderly, perhaps 70, with a long white beard and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at him. He introduced himself as Brother Vassal and spoke in accented but clear English. After a brief welcome, Brother Vassal led him through a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands into the main hall. The interior was cold, far colder than the outside air, and their footsteps echoed off stone floors polished smooth by generations of sandaled feet. Brother Vassal walked him through winding corridors, past chapels and dormitories, a refectory that smelled of old incense and older wood, and finally to a small cell that would serve as his quarters. The room contained a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a desk with an oil lamp, and a crucifix on the wall. A single window looked out onto the inner courtyard. Brother Vassal set down the luggage and turned to face him with an expression that had shifted from welcoming to grave. The monk pulled a folded paper from his robe and placed it on the desk. He explained that these were the rules of the monastery, regulations that all residents must follow without exception. His voice carried a weight that suggested these were not mere guidelines, but boundaries that should not be tested. The locksmith unfolded the paper and began to read, while Brother Vassal waited in silence. The first rule stated that he must never enter the chapel between midnight and 3 in the morning. The second prohibited him from speaking to any monk who wore a black rope belt rather than a brown one. And furthermore, if approached by such a monk, he was to immediately return to his cell and lock the door until dawn. The third rule instructed him to ignore any sounds of chanting that occurred outside of the scheduled prayer times listed on the attached schedule. The fourth warned him never to answer if someone knocked on his door 3 times in rapid succession. The fifth and most emphasized rule, underlined twice in red ink, stated that under no circumstances was he to attempt to open, examine, or even touch the 7 sealed doors located throughout the monastery. These doors would be marked with a red wax seal bearing the monastery's crest. He looked up from the paper to find Brother Vassal studying his face. The monk asked if he understood and agreed to abide by these rules. Something in the old man's tone suggested that curiosity or defiance had not ended well for others. He nodded his agreement, and Brother Vassal's expression softened slightly. The monk told him that dinner would be brought to his cell that evening, and that work would begin the following morning after dawn prayers. With that, Brother Vassal departed, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Alone in the cell, he sat on the bed and read through the rules again. In his years working with old religious institutions, he had encountered many peculiarities. Some churches had areas designated off-limits for structural reasons, others for religious significance. He had worked in a cathedral once where a specific stairwell was never to be used because a bishop had died falling down it, and the space was considered cursed by the staff. Usually there were practical explanations dressed up in tradition and superstition. Still, something about the specificity of these rules unsettled him. The detail about the black rope belts especially seemed bizarre. Dinner arrived as promised, brought by a young monk who knocked once, entered, set down a tray of bread and soup, and left without making eye contact. The food was simple but warm, and he ate while reviewing the documents Brother Vassal had left. Along with the rules was a map of the monastery marked with the locations he would be working. The building was larger than he had initially realized, a sprawling complex built over several centuries, with additions and modifications that created a maze-like layout. Red X marks indicated the sealed doors he was to avoid. He counted them on the map. 7 as stated, distributed throughout the structure with no apparent pattern. His first night passed restlessly. The silence of the monastery was not truly silent, but filled with the sounds old buildings make: wood creaking, wind moving through gaps in stone, the settling of ancient foundations. At one point, he woke to what sounded like distant singing, a low droning chant in a language he did not recognize. He checked the schedule Brother Vassal had provided. It was past midnight, outside of any listed prayer time. He remembered the third rule and pulled the thin blanket over his head, waiting until the sound faded before attempting sleep again. Morning came gray and cold. He washed his face in the basin provided and dressed in his work clothes. A knock at the door announced Brother Vassal, who led him to the refectory for a breakfast of porridge and tea. A dozen monks sat at long tables, eating in silence. He noticed that most wore brown rope belts, but two near the far end wore black. He looked away quickly, recalling the second rule. After breakfast, Brother Vassal took him to begin the work. The first week would focus on the northern wing, where many of the doors had locks dating back 2 or 3 centuries. His job was to clean, oil, and assess them for functionality and security. Some would need parts replaced, others merely maintenance. Brother Vassal provided him with a leather logbook to record his findings and left him to work. The first door he examined was to a storage room filled with old vestments and ceremonial items. The lock was a simple warded design, common in the 18th century. He disassembled it carefully, cleaned each component, and reassembled it with fresh oil. The work was meditative, requiring focus, but not intense concentration, leaving his mind free to wander. As he worked, he became aware of footsteps in the corridor outside. They would approach, pause near the door, then continue on. This happened several times over the course of the morning. By midday, he had completed 4 doors and was making notes in the logbook when he heard the footsteps again. This time, they stopped directly outside. A shadow fell across the gap beneath the door. He waited for a knock or for the door to open, but neither came. The shadow remained. Minutes passed. He stood and approached the door, intending to open it, but something made him hesitate. He knelt and looked through the keyhole. A figure stood in the corridor, its back to the door. It wore monk's robes, but the posture was wrong, too stiff and angular. The head tilted slowly to one side, then the other, as if listening. He held his breath. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, before finally moving away down the corridor with a shuffling gait that sounded wrong against the stone floor. He waited a full 5 minutes before opening the door to an empty hallway. Lunch was brought to wherever he was working, usually by the same young monk who had delivered his dinner. The boy never spoke, and when their eyes met, the monk quickly looked away. In the afternoon, he moved to the eastern section of the northern wing, working on doors that led to monk cells. Most were unoccupied, the rooms empty except for basic furniture. In one cell, he found a journal written in Romanian. He could not read it, but the final entries were marked with sketches of doors, each one depicted with chains and crosses. The handwriting in these later pages became increasingly erratic. As the afternoon wore on, he became aware of a smell. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss as the natural mustiness of an old building, but it grew stronger as he worked his way down the corridor. A sick, sweet odor like rotting flowers mixed with something more acrid. The smell seemed to emanate from further down the hall, past where his work assignments ended for the day. He checked his map. At the end of that corridor was one of the 7 sealed doors, marked with a red X curiosity pulled at him. But the memory of Brother Vassel's grave expression when discussing the rules kept him in place. He finished his work on the current door and retreated back the way he had come. By the time he reached the refectory for dinner, the smell had faded from his nostrils, though the memory of it lingered. That night, he lay in his bed, listening to the monastery settle around him. At some point past midnight, he heard the chanting again, that same droning rhythm in an unknown language. He tried to ignore it as instructed, but after several minutes, his curiosity overcame caution. He rose and went to the window. The courtyard below was empty, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As he watched, a figure emerged from the shadows on the far side of the courtyard. It wore monk's robes and moved across the open space with the same shuffling gait he had observed earlier. The figure stopped in the center of the courtyard and stood motionless, face turned upward toward his window. He stepped back from the glass, heart racing. When he looked again, the courtyard was empty. The second day proceeded much like the first. More doors, more locks, the meditative work of restoration and documentation. He tried to focus on the craftsmanship of the mechanisms, the clever designs that had protected these spaces for centuries. A monk passed him in the corridor, this one wearing a black rope belt. He remembered the rule and immediately turned away, walking quickly in the opposite direction until he reached a stairwell. He climbed 2 floors and waited, counting to 100 before descending again. On the 3rd day, while working in what had once been the monastery's library, he found another document. It had fallen behind a shelf, yellowed with age and written in Latin. He recognized a few words from his limited knowledge. Words like porta, which meant door or gate, and occludier, which he believed meant to close or seal. There were sketches similar to those he had found in the journal, depicting doors covered in symbols and chains. At the bottom of the page was a date, 1724. Brother Vassel appeared that afternoon while he was working on a particularly complex lock. The monk watched in silence for several minutes before speaking. He asked how the work was progressing and whether everything had been satisfactory. His tone was casual, but his eyes held that same searching quality from their first meeting. The locksmith assured him that everything was fine and that the work was fascinating from a historical perspective. Brother Vasil nodded slowly and then asked if he had encountered anything unusual or disturbing. The question hung in the air between them. He considered mentioning the figure in the courtyard, the shuffling footsteps, the smell. But something in Brother Vasil's expression suggested that acknowledging these things would be a mistake, perhaps even dangerous. He replied that he had encountered nothing unusual, just the expected quirks of an old building. The monk studied him for a long moment before nodding and departing without another word. That night he was awakened not by chanting, but by knocking. 3 rapid knocks on his door, a pause, then 3 more. He sat up in bed, remembering the 4th rule: do not answer. The knocking came again, insistent. A voice called his name from the other side of the door, asking if he was awake, saying that Brother Vasil needed to speak with him urgently. The voice sounded wrong, the accent too thick, the pronunciation of his name slightly off. He remained silent, barely breathing. The knocking continued for several minutes before finally stopping. He heard footsteps retreat down the corridor, but they had that same shuffling quality he had noticed before. The next morning at breakfast, he saw Brother Vasil seated at the head table. The monk nodded to him in greeting, and he felt a wave of relief. Whatever had knocked on his door last night, it had not been Brother Vasil. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cold refectory air. His work took him deeper into the monastery. The northern wing complete, he moved to the western section, which housed the monastery's administrative rooms and what had once been the abbot's quarters. The abbot had died decades ago, Brother Vasil explained, and no replacement had been appointed. The rooms remained locked and unused. As he worked on the door to the abbot's study, he noticed scratch marks on the wood around the lock, deep gouges that looked fresh despite the room's long abandonment. Inside the study, dust lay thick on every surface except for a path that led from the door to the desk and back. Someone had been in here recently, or something had. He examined the room while cleaning the interior lock mechanism. Books lined the walls, most in Latin or Romanian. The desk held papers covered in the same tight handwriting he had seen in the journal. More sketches of doors, more notes he could not read. One drawing showed a door with 7 locks, each one labeled with a word he did not recognize. He photographed several of the pages with his phone, thinking he might try to translate them later. But when he checked the images that evening in his cell, they showed only blank paper. The writing had not appeared in the photographs. He tried again with different pages, different lighting, but the result was always the same: blank paper. He deleted the photos and tried not to think about the implications. On the 6th day, he encountered one of the sealed doors up close. He had been assigned to work on a storage room nearby, and the sealed door was simply there in the corridor, impossible to avoid seeing as he passed. The door itself was unremarkable, heavy wood like all the others, but it was covered in chains that looked both ancient and new somehow. The red wax seal Brother Vassal had mentioned was pressed into the center, bearing a crest he did not recognize, a cross surrounded by 7 stars. He kept his distance as instructed and tried not to stare, but something about the door drew his attention. The wood around it seemed darker than the surrounding stone, as if stained by something that had seeped through from the other side. While working on the nearby storage room door, he became aware of a sound. It was faint, barely audible, coming from the direction of the sealed door. A rhythmic creaking, like someone slowly rocking back and forth. He tried to ignore it and focus on his work, but the sound continued. Against his better judgment, he looked down the corridor at the sealed door. It was moving, not opening, but breathing almost, bulging outwards slightly, then settling back, over and over in that same rhythm. He watched, transfixed, until the sound of footsteps approaching snapped him back to alertness. He quickly returned to his work, and when he glanced back moments later, the sealed door was still. A monk he had not seen before rounded the corner. The man was younger than most of the others, perhaps 40, with a gaunt face and eyes that seemed sunken into his skull. He wore a black rope belt. The locksmith immediately looked down at his tools, pretending to be absorbed in his work. The monk stopped walking. He could feel eyes on him, boring into the back of his head. Seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the footsteps resumed, moving past him and continuing down the corridor. He did not look up until he was certain the monk was gone. That evening during dinner, he noticed the monastery seemed more populated than it had been. Where before he had seen perhaps a dozen monks, now there were at least 20 in the refectory. Several wore black belts. They sat together at one end of the long table, eating in silence like the others. But there was something synchronized about their movements. They all lifted their spoons at the same time. All turned their heads at the same moment to look toward the door when someone entered. He kept his eyes on his own plate and finished his meal quickly. The second week began with a change in assignment. Brother Vassal informed him that he would now be working in the underground levels, the oldest part of the monastery. The catacombs and storage chambers beneath the main structure dated back to the monastery's founding in the 16th century. Many of the doors there had not been opened in decades and would require more intensive work. Brother Vassal provided him with a better lamp and wished him luck with an expression that suggested he would need it. The descent into the underground was steep and narrow. Stone steps, worn smooth by centuries, spiraled downward into darkness, barely held back by his lamp. The temperature dropped with each step, and moisture glistened on the walls. At the bottom, a corridor stretched in both directions, lined with doors. His breath fogged in the cold air. He checked his map and headed left, toward the first marked location. The smell down here was worse. That same sick, sweet odor he had encountered before, but stronger, mixed with damp earth and something metallic. The first door he came to was swollen with moisture, the wood warped and the lock corroded. It took him over an hour to disassemble the mechanism without damaging it further. While he worked, he heard sounds deeper in the catacombs, scraping like something being dragged across stone. Footsteps that echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. He told himself it was just acoustics, the way sound behaved in these underground spaces. Behind the first door was a storage chamber filled with old crates and barrels. He examined several and found them empty. The one crate's interior was stained dark with something that had long since dried. The next door led to what appeared to be an old wine cellar, the racks empty, but for a few broken bottles. The third door would not open even after he repaired the lock. Something on the other side was blocking it. He pushed hard, felt resistance, and decided to note it in the logbook and move on. The fourth door in that corridor was sealed. He almost missed it in the dim light, but the red wax seal gleamed in his lamp's glow. Chains crisscrossed the door. Secured with locks he immediately recognized as his own work. Not literally his own locks, but the same model he had designed and built for a museum 3 years prior. Seeing them here in a monastery that predated their creation by centuries made no sense. He approached closer, studying them. They were identical, down to the serial numbers he always engraved on the interior. His serial numbers, his locks, impossible. He reached out to touch one of the locks, needing to confirm it was real, but stopped himself inches away. The fifth rule echoed in his mind. Do not touch the sealed doors. He pulled his hand back and stepped away, his heart pounding. As he did, he heard something from the other side of the door. A voice, muffled by the wood, but clear enough to understand. It was calling his name, not just his name, but his full name, including his middle name that appeared only on official documents, that he never used, that no one at the monastery should know. The voice asked him to open the door, said it was cold on the other side, said he could help. He backed away down the corridor, not turning around until he reached the stairs. He climbed back to the main level and found Brother Vasil in the chapel. The monk was praying, or appeared to be, kneeling before the altar with his head bowed. The locksmith waited at the back of the chapel, unsure whether to interrupt. After several minutes, Brother Vasil crossed himself and stood, turning to face him. The monk asked if something was wrong. He opened his mouth to explain about the locks, about the voice, but the words would not come. Brother Vasil's expression was patient, but knowing, as if he had seen this reaction before. Finally, he asked about the sealed doors, what was behind them, why they needed to remain closed. Brother Vasil's expression hardened. The monk said that some questions were better left unasked. Some knowledge was dangerous to possess. The doors were sealed for the protection of everyone in the monastery and everyone who might visit it. They had been sealed by those who understood what was necessary, and they must remain sealed. He wanted to press further, to demand real answers, but something in Brother Vassal's tone made it clear the conversation was over. That night, the chanting was louder and more insistent. It woke him from a light sleep, and this time he could make out words, though they were in that same unknown language. The rhythm was hypnotic, drawing him despite his desire to ignore it. He went to the window and looked out. The courtyard was filled with figures in robes. They stood in a circle around something he could not quite see, all chanting in unison. He counted them. 23, more than he had seen in the refectory. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the figures all turned as one to look up at his window. 24 faces pale in the moonlight, eyes reflecting his lamp like animals. He stumbled backward from the window and pressed himself against the wall, lamp extinguished, until the chanting finally faded near dawn. The next day, he continued working in the catacombs despite his reluctance. The work needed to be completed, and leaving the contract early would mean forfeiting most of his payment. He told himself to focus on the locks, on the mechanical problems that needed solving, and to ignore everything else. This resolution lasted until he opened a door to what should have been another storage chamber, and instead found a corridor he did not remember seeing on his map. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and stretched beyond the reach of his lamp. The walls were not stone, but something else, something darker that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, he stepped inside. The door swung shut behind him with a sound like an exhale. He spun around and tried the handle. Locked. Impossible, as he had just repaired the lock, and it had no mechanism to seal from inside. He pulled his tools from his belt and began working to open it, hands shaking. Behind him in the dark corridor, something moved. He heard it clearly, the shuffle of feet on that strange, not quite stone floor. He worked faster, forcing the lock picks into the mechanism with less care than he should. The footsteps came closer. His lamp flickered. The lock clicked open, and he fell through the doorway back into the familiar catacomb corridor. The door slammed shut on its own. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not stopping until he reached the stairs. He spent the rest of that day working on doors in the main level, near other people, in corridors with windows that let in gray daylight. Brother Vassal found him that evening and asked about his progress in the catacombs. He lied, said he had completed the assigned work, and was ready to move to the next section. The monk studied him with those penetrating eyes and nodded slowly. Tomorrow he would work on the eastern wing. Above ground, plenty of natural light. But that night, he could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that dark corridor, heard those shuffling footsteps. He sat at his desk and tried to make sense of what was happening. The monastery was old, and old places had their quirks. The monks were eccentric, but religious communities often were. The rules seemed strange, but they were probably rooted in tradition or practical concerns. He did not understand. He tried to rationalize everything, to find mundane explanations. The exercise felt hollow. At midnight, he heard the 3 knocks again. This time he was ready, sitting in his chair facing the door, with his lamp turned low. The knocks came in that same rapid pattern. A voice called to him, but it was different from before. This voice sounded like his mother, asking him to open the door, saying she had traveled so far to see him. His mother had been dead for 5 years. The voice continued, growing more insistent, taking on an edge of anger. How dare he ignore her? After everything she had done. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the lock. He sat frozen, unable to move or speak. The turning stopped. Footsteps retreated. He did not move from the chair until dawn. The eastern wing was a relief after the catacombs. Large windows let in pale sunlight, and the corridors were wide and airy. He worked on doors to classrooms where young monks had once studied, to a music room with an ancient organ, to a gallery hung with paintings of saints and martyrs. The work was straightforward, the kind of restoration he had done 100 times before. For a few hours, he could almost forget the sealed doors and the figures in the courtyard and the impossible locks bearing his serial numbers. Then he found the painting. It hung at the end of a long gallery, larger than the others, depicting a scene he did not recognize from scripture. 7 monks stood around a door, their hands raised in gestures of warding or binding. The door in the painting was covered in chains and bore a red wax seal. Behind the door, visible through cracks in the wood, were eyes. Dozens of eyes, all different colors, all staring out at the viewer. At the bottom of the frame was a brass plaque with an inscription in Latin. He used his phone to translate it. The words that came back made him wish he had not. They who built the doors to hold what should not be let out. He took a photo of the painting. This time the image held, showing every detail, including those staring eyes. He studied the faces of the monks in the painting more closely. One of them looked familiar. It took him a moment to place it, and when he did, his blood went cold. It was Brother Vassal. Not someone who looked like Brother Vassal, but the man himself, unchanged by what should have been 3 centuries. He was wearing the same expression he had worn when discussing the rules. Grave, warning, knowing. The locksmith left the gallery and went looking for Brother Vassal. He searched the refectory, the chapel, the administrative wing. No one had seen the old monk since morning prayers. He asked the young monk who brought meals where Brother Vassal could be found. The boy looked at him with fear in his eyes and shook his head, refusing to speak. Finally, another monk, one of the few who wore brown belts, told him that Brother Vasil had descended to the catacombs on monastery business and would return by evening. He did not want to go back underground, but he needed answers. The painting had changed everything. Whatever was happening here was not superstition or tradition. It was real, and it had been real for a very long time. He gathered his tools and his lamp and descended the spiral stairs once more into the cold darkness below. The catacombs seemed different now. The corridors that had been merely old and dark before felt hostile, oppressive. His lamp seemed to provide less light than it should, the shadows pressing in from all sides. He called out for Brother Vasil, but received no answer. He walked deeper, checking each branch corridor, each chamber. The smell grew stronger. That sick, sweet rot mixed with incense and old earth. He found Brother Vasil in a chamber near one of the sealed doors. The monk was standing with his back to the entrance, facing the chained door, whispering something too low to hear. The locksmith called to him, and Brother Vasil turned slowly. The old monk's face was streaked with tears, and his expression was one of profound sorrow. He asked how the work was progressing, as if they had just met in the refectory, rather than deep underground near a door that breathed and moved. His tone was too casual, too normal for the situation. The locksmith demanded to know what was behind the sealed doors. Brother Vasil closed his eyes and sighed. When he opened them again, they held a weariness that seemed to span centuries. The monk said that knowledge carried a price, and some prices were too high to pay. But if he truly needed to know, if he could not simply trust and obey the rules, then he would tell him. What lay behind the sealed doors were mistakes, errors, things that had been invited in long ago by monks who thought they understood forces they did not. Things that could not be destroyed, only contained. 7 of them, bound behind 7 doors, held by prayer and will and ancient locks. The locksmith asked about the painting, about Brother Vasil's face, unchanged after 300 years. The monk smiled sadly. Time worked differently for those who took on certain responsibilities. He had made a choice long ago to remain, to maintain the seals, to ensure that what had been bound stayed bound. Others had made the same choice, accepting the weight of immortality in service of protection. The monks with black belts were those who had fallen to temptation, who had listened too long to the voices behind the doors, who had begun to serve what they were meant to guard against. They could not leave the monastery any more than Brother Vasil could, bound by different chains. He asked, why bring him here? Why hire a locksmith to work on doors when the most important doors must never be opened? Brother Vasil explained that the other locks needed maintenance. The monastery was still a holy place, still served its function, even if its primary purpose was containment, and every few decades, they needed someone with skill to examine the seals, to ensure the locks were still sound, to add new ones if necessary. Most lasted a few days before breaking under the strain of what they sensed. Some fled in the night. A rare few completed the work and left, their memories of the experience fading, until they convinced themselves it had all been dreams and nerves. He had been hired because his reputation suggested he might be one of the few who could handle it. The locksmith said he wanted to leave. Brother Vassal nodded. The 2 weeks were not quite up, but close enough. The monk would arrange for the car to return in the morning. He should pack his things and remain in his cell until dawn. Under no circumstances should he leave his room after dark tonight. Not for any reason, no matter what he heard or who called to him. The things behind the doors knew he had been in the monastery, knew someone new had walked these halls, and they would make a final attempt to reach him before he left. Brother Vassal's expression was grave once more as he gave these instructions. They ascended together from the catacombs. At the top, Brother Vassal clasped his shoulder and spoke a blessing in Latin. Then the old monk turned and walked away down the corridor, his footsteps echoing long after he disappeared from sight. The locksmith returned to his cell and packed his tools and his few belongings. He checked that the door was locked, checked the window was secure, and settled in to wait for morning. He tried to read, to focus on anything other than the coming night. The sun set early this far north at this time of year, and darkness came swiftly. The chanting started just after full dark. It was louder than ever before, coming from directly outside his door. He heard footsteps in the corridor, many feet moving in procession. Voices called his name, some familiar, some not. His mother again, then his father who had died when he was young, then friends from childhood. They asked him to open the door to join them. The doorknob rattled. Something scratched at the wood. He sat in his chair, facing the door, with his lamp turned as high as it would go, and did not move. Hours passed. The voices changed. They stopped pleading and started threatening. They described what they would do if he opened the door, and then what they would do when he eventually had to open it, because he could not stay in this room forever. The specificity of their threats was worse than anything he had imagined. He covered his ears, but the voices seemed to come from inside his head. The walls of the cell began to sweat, moisture running down the stone in rivulets. The temperature dropped until he could see his breath. At some point past midnight, the knocking started. Not 3 rapid knocks, but a steady pounding, over and over, shaking the door in its frame. He watched the lock, watched the wood flex and strain. His own locks on the sealed doors came to mind. If they could be breached, how much hope did this simple cell door have? The pounding intensified. The crucifix fell from the wall and shattered on the floor. The window cracked. He gripped the arms of his chair and prayed to gods he had not spoken to since childhood. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The pounding ceased. The voices fell silent. The air warmed slightly, and the moisture on the walls began to evaporate. He heard footsteps retreating down the corridor, that shuffling gait fading into the distance. He checked his watch. 3 in the morning. The same time the chapel was forbidden territory. He sat in the chair, not daring to move, and waited for dawn. First light came gray and weak through the cracked window. He heard footsteps approaching, a normal gait this time, and a knock at the door. Brother Vassil's voice called that the car was ready. He opened the door to find the corridor empty, except for the old monk. Brother Vassil looked exhausted, as if he had not slept. He asked if the night had been difficult. The locksmith nodded. The monk said it was over now. He had endured, and he could leave. They walked together through the monastery to the main entrance. In the daylight, with other monks moving about their morning routines, the building seemed less menacing. Almost normal. Brother Vassil opened the heavy door and stepped aside. The car was waiting on the path below. The monk handed him an envelope, the remainder of his payment. Then he spoke words that would stay with the locksmith for the rest of his life. He said that the world was full of old places with old secrets, doors that should remain closed, things that should not be let out. Most people went through their lives, never knowing how close they came to these boundaries, never realizing that there were those who stood guard in the thin places. Now he knew. He could choose to remember or choose to forget, but either way, he could never unknow what he had learned. The locksmith descended the path to the waiting car. He did not look back at the monastery during the drive down the mountain. He tried to process everything that had happened, but his thoughts felt slippery, hard to hold. By the time he reached the bus, the details were already fuzzy. The train ride back was a blur of scenery and half-formed memories. When he finally reached his apartment days later, he found the envelope from Brother Vassil and opened it. Inside was the money promised and a note in elegant handwriting. It said only, "Thank you for your service. The work continues." He tried to return to normal life, to take on regular contracts and forget about the monastery, but he found himself researching, looking up the history of the place. Records were scarce and contradictory. Some sources said the monastery had been abandoned in the 19th century. Others claimed it had never existed at all, that the location he had visited was empty mountain with no structures. He found the painting he had photographed in an archive, but the monk who looked like Brother Vassil was labeled as Father Andre, deceased 1729, the date on the document he had found in the library. Months passed. He took jobs and did his work with the same skill as always, but something had changed. He noticed things he had not before, doors in old buildings that had no reason to be there, locks that seemed designed to keep things in rather than out, marks on thresholds that looked like warding symbols. He began to see patterns, connections, how many old churches and monasteries and temples had sections that were off limits, spaces that no one entered. How many were like the mountain monastery, prisons disguised as holy places. One night, he received an email from an address he did not recognize. The message contained only a location and a date. A monastery in Scotland was looking for someone with his particular skills. The pay was generous. The work would take 3 weeks. He stared at the email for a long time, cursor hovering over the delete button. Then he opened his calendar and marked the date. Some doors needed to be maintained. Some locks needed to be checked, and someone had to do the work. He replied to the email with a single word: accepted. The world had its secrets, its thin places where the boundaries were weak. And in those places, there were doors, and those doors needed locks, and those locks needed someone who understood their importance. He had become part of something larger than himself, a network of watchers and guardians that stretched back centuries. Brother Vassal was one. Now, in a small way, so was he. He packed his tools and prepared for the journey. The work continued. It always had, and it always would, for as long as there were things that needed to be kept sealed away. As long as there were doors that must never be opened, as long as there were those willing to stand guard in the darkness and hold the line against what waited on the other side. The locksmith had found his calling, not in the simple mechanics of tumblers and pins, but in understanding that some locks were not meant to be picked, some doors were not meant to be opened, and some secrets were worth keeping, no matter the cost. He took one last look at his apartment, knowing he might not return for weeks. Then he locked the door behind him and headed out into the night, toward the next monastery, the next set of seals that needed his attention. The work continued, and now he was part of it. In the mountains of Scotland, another ancient structure waited. Another set of doors. Another chance to ensure that what had been bound would stay bound. He thought of Brother Vassal, still standing guard after 300 years, and wondered if that would be his fate too. Part of him hoped it would not be. But another part, the part that had been changed by his time in the Carpathians, understood that some responsibilities could not be refused. Some duties transcended a single lifetime. The plane took off into dark skies, carrying him toward his next assignment. Below, cities sparkled with electric light, millions of people living their lives unaware of the old places, the thin places, the doors that held back the dark. They did not need to know. That was the point. The work happened in shadow, maintained by those who had seen what others had not, who knew what others did not. The locksmith closed his eyes and tried to rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doors, new locks to examine and maintain. The work was never truly finished. It could not be, but it could be continued, one lock at a time, one door at a time, one monastery at a time, for as long as there were those willing to do what needed to be done. In his pocket, the note from Brother Vassal had become a talisman. Thank you for your service. The work continues. 4 simple sentences that contained a truth he now understood. The work did continue. It always had, And somewhere in mountains and valleys and hidden places around the world, others like Brother Vassal kept their vigil, maintaining the seals, checking the locks, ensuring that 7 doors or 70 or 700 remained closed. He was part of that now, part of the ancient tradition of guardians and watchers. His skills, once used for simple security and restoration, now served a higher purpose. He thought about the voice that had known his full name, the locks that bore his serial numbers, the painting that had shown the truth. The monastery had tested him, and he had passed. Now the real work could begin. The plane flew on through the night. Somewhere ahead, another monastery waited. Another set of rules to follow. Another set of sealed doors to protect. The locksmith opened his eyes and looked out the window at the darkness beyond. Out there in that vast shadow were things that people had forgotten or never knew existed. Things that had been locked away by those who understood the necessity of imprisonment over destruction. And he would help keep them locked away for as long as he was able, for as long as he was needed. The work continued. It always would. Some doors must stay sealed, and he would make sure they did.